Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors, to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have with me the venerable space captain, Michael. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm all right. You?
I'm doing quite well, actually. Yeah, I've had a decent day. Been getting through tons of editing this last month, and I'm excited to get back into working on some of my own fiction. Um, Writing probably not too many good characters. By good, I mean like writing good, like writing the good and the just, the virtuous, whatever that happens to mean, because that, my friends, is what we're going to be talking about today on the podcast. Writing good, what is virtue, what is writing morally virtuous characters or stories for that matter. But before we get into it, Michael, do you have anywhere that you want to send people to check out your stuff?
You can check me out on minds.com/AETERNIS. Daily writing questions, writing excerpts, short stories, and I'm hoping to have something that people can buy coming up in the next few months. So look there for announcements and where to find it.
And do check out Michael's stuff. It is quite excellent. He is a rather famous figure on that little tiny corner of the internet, and I'm very happy to be able to participate in those daily questions and to be acquainted. And if you want to check out my stuff, you can head over to wildislelit.com. I've got tons of things over there. Short stories, excerpts, essays, throwing audio to all that. I have an audiobook for my novel that's out. You can get in print as well. Want Smoke Broken, a weird fantasy fiction novel. I've been messing with the pitch over and over again. Just see it for yourself. There's an audiobook there. You can listen to my favorite supervillain, Dagoth, or read it. So there's no excuse. And while you're over there, if you happen to be an author, which you are likely if you're listening to this writing cast, you can hire me as a line editor. That's right. The Wild Isle Style Guide is my service. Again, over at my website, wildislelit.com. I can help you develop your own unique voice and make your work really stand out, sharpen your prose so that you are doing more than just content, you're also composing. All right. I don't think I have anything else to pitch. Other podcasts are on there, blogs, all kind of stuff. Now, without further ado, let's get into the topic for today. And I actually think this is going to be a really, really interesting topic because we're kind of tackling one of the deepest questions in all of philosophy. It's like at the bottom of all moral philosophy because we to understand writing good or writing good characters, writing themes that promote something like goodness or virtue, we kind of have to start with what is good. So, Michael, I think I'll throw this off to you. Do you have a definition of good or goodness that you fall back on?
Obviously, as a Christian, my sense of good comes from God as expressed in the biblical record and among other sources. But the biblical record being obviously the standard. Obviously, if you're not Christian, you have to kind of come up with your own. A Christian acceptable definition of good, which can work for other people, is something along the lines of um, something that is working within the confines of the world as best you understand it to bring forward the plan of God, or as you know, if you want to take a more abstract sense of that, to move the world forward in some way that is long-term beneficial. And of course, the problem with that, taking it in a more agnostic sense of the term, is that you have a lot of caveats built into it, which is why I prefer to just keep it simpler when I talk about these things. Because when I say, working for the good as defined by God, there is no need for me to go and dissemble and talk about all the caveats that make that phrase work, because it just does. But obviously, many people don't accept that term, so I will try in this to work from a more psychological and a more agnostic set of definitions.
Yeah. What would you say if I said I could probably help us bridge the gap a little bit between our secular listeners and our religious listeners? Because I think fundamentally there is, I actually shouldn't call it secular because that's not exactly right, but there is a more agnostic definition that does not at all contradict, I think, with the with your particular Christian definition, or perhaps if we had another Christian, that might give something very slightly different once you get into the nuances. But your simple form works for here. So I'm going to give that a try. Actually, I want you to tell me if this bridges for you. So that'll be good for us for the conversation because that way we're on the same page. So
Sure.
yeah, I did a tiny bit of like 2 second digging on the etymology of good because often find the way that the word arose in language naturally captures what people were looking at, right? And when I say looking at, it means they were trying to capture something that was fundamentally real and describe it with an idea before it gets abstracted and then abstracted again and again and again through the evolution of language and the evolution of cultures. So we have here um, from this is spanning Old English, something like a cobbling of excellent, fine, valuable, desirable, favorable, beneficial, full, entire, complete, and also advantage, benefit, gift, virtue, property. Now that spans way too much, right? So that's on its own, that's not really useful. But if we look at some of the Proto Germanic, it's something like fitting or suitable. Or in later Old English, we have good development to kind, benevolent, holy. And then only later does it get applied to be skilled, something like well behaved or large of great value. So when we say like someone is a good carpenter, that's actually an abstraction off of the original definition. I think if we go back as far as we can, the words fitting and suitable are probably really key here. And why
Yep.
is that? Well, oh yeah, see, I can see we're starting to agree already. So for those of you who have listened to me talk on the podcast quite a lot, I often operate with I guess I'll describe it as like a secular agnostic definition of God, which I actually think is uh, I think is a Catholic definition that comes from the phrasing like "I am that I am," something like rephrasing that as like "God is that which is like saying there's nothing more fundamental or nothing more essential than God. Like God is the let's say you could say like God is the object to which we are all subject, which is different than a lot of times people lionize the subject, but we forget that if you're a subject, you're subject to, right?
Yep.
Something else. Subjects are not the masters, they are the thing that are mastered over. And then we look at that definition fitting, suitable, and all of a sudden things seem to snap together because if God is the object, God is what is real. There's nothing more real than God. There's nothing more full or entire than complete than God. Like there's like God is that which is. There is you can't contradict God, right? That you can think of. We describe it as God's plan, which is a very human way of describing it. But you could almost think of it like God is that if God is that which is, God is that inevitability. God is what you must conform to because fundamentally, you know, it is what is, and your desires, your plans are not necessarily, extant outside of you, but God is, right? So
Yeah.
if we could, yeah, and I'll stop here, but we could bridge the gap and say what is good is in accord with God and God's will. God's
Yes.
will is that which is or that is which is, and that therefore that which is suited to the objective circumstance, which is the same thing as saying the will of God to me anyway. Like I don't when I hear like the will of God, I hear the objective set of circumstances with those particular people in that particular time and place in accordance with the essential fundamental laws of reality. So
Mhm.
in terms of our definitions, do you think they're the same actually? Like if I think that is which is fitting and suitable is good in yours?
I think that there are some things that are lost there, but for the purposes of fiction writing, I don't think they're that significant. One thing that I will point out while you were talking there, this is probably something some of the audience has heard. If you go through something like Jordan Peterson's walkthrough of the Book of Genesis or something like that, he, at least when he did that, wasn't much of a believer in the literal God, but he would still use the Word of God, the plan of God, things like that in there in a psychological sense. I think his analysis is very interesting, but I do think it's a little incomplete. But for the purposes of stories and fiction writing, it is certainly complete enough to get a good picture of how to describe good and evil inside of the context of a story. Because inside of the context of a story, you don't necessarily like the preconditions of the world are not the same as the preconditions of our world, and whether or not you think a literal, actual, person of God is a precondition of our world doesn't matter if you're writing a story where that isn't the precondition. So, in a sense, um, when you're writing, especially speculative fiction, you have a certain amount of flexibility to iron out those wrinkles between where I think some of that stuff falls short, personally. So I think in most cases that is sufficient for this conversation.
Excellent. So hopefully our viewers here, or listeners, I really should say, can all follow us regardless of whether they're coming from a religious perspective or not, which is what I would like. Now, we seem to have come, we solved the mystery of the definition of good, right? I realize we're standing on the shoulders of people who've thought this through much, much more deeply, which makes it much easier for us. It's not that we're super geniuses. Well, certainly not I. But with good somewhat established here, there, I think virtue also plays a role because when people think of someone who's good, they usually think that synonymous with saying someone or some character is virtuous. So, two questions. What would you define as virtuous, and is good the same as virtuousness?
There is a high amount of overlap. Virtue is generally a description assigned to a character or a set of actions that are good in the context of their setting. So virtue is sort of the property of something that does good, whereas good is more of, I guess you could describe an action as good. A person who repeatedly does good things as virtuous, I guess would be my distinction.
Yeah, I agree with the heavy overlap here. Because if you dig back and you look at the word it comes from, and I guess this is a really controversial term, but virtue, um, there's a bunch of words associated with it. And when we think of our common definition of like, good is essentially that which is in accord with God's will, right? This will make sense. But virtue is like moral life and conduct, a particular moral excellence, force, strength, vigor, moral strength, qualities, qualities and abilities, moral strength, high character, goodness, manliness, valor, bravery, courage, and war, excellence, worth. And it comes from virtue, comes from a root meaning man. However, if we look at the word virtue as it gets expanded on other areas, like we think of as it's applied to, well, like what's a virtuous woman, it's typically chastity or sexual purity. And I think that tells us something right away. What that tells us is what is virtuous are those qualities that lead to one being able to fulfill the will of God. And that changes as we try to apply that to different types of people. In this case, um, what hopefully shouldn't be controversial. YouTube don't kill us, but um, when you apply it to men and women, there are different virtues because there are different circumstances surrounding their what Aristotle would call telos. Um,
Yes, and it's not just gender specific. There are definitely going to be situations where it is virtuous for one person to be a pacifist or to not fight, and virtuous for another person in very similar situations where basically the only factor is the person. It will be virtuous for them to fight, to take action, to stand up, potentially do something violent. Um, and so it's not about just the action. It's the action with the context of the world around the person and the person themselves. And that's one of the advantages in fiction, is because oftentimes you have a window into the psyche, the mind of the person who's taking the action. So we can very much more clearly define and demonstrate which actions are virtuous and which ones are not.
yeah, that does allow for what I would argue many themes to arise in their given times. I've noticed at least that this conversation keeps bringing about that there is a kind of, I don't want to call it a mystery, but there's an unknown factor, right? That we human beings are constantly trying to figure out, which is okay, given these particular people or given myself in these different circumstances, you could ask it this way, like, what is God's will in the situation? Like there's a kind of humility that one takes to try and find out what is virtuous for me in this given place and time. Um, Now, sometimes that's like really, whether in fiction or whether in real life, that's pretty standard for most people for most of the time, throughout most of time, right? Like usually murder is bad. Well, murder, it depends on how you define things, right? But there is a time where, you're defending your family from an invading host of barbarians, and then like, well, you know, it's,
That wouldn't be murder,
we,
though. The way we
correct.
definitionally assign murder is that it is not in defense, right? Murder is an action that you take to kill somebody who is specifically somebody who is not defending themselves at that particular moment, right? Even when two people get in a fight and they're really trying to hurt each other and one of them dies, we don't usually call that murder. We call that manslaughter for a very good reason, because we understand that the term murder is reserved for when you should not have done that.
Yeah, that falls. I used to make an argument that's basically based on universal preferable behavior. If you guys know about Stefan Molyneux years ago, where I would play around with the word murder, doing exactly that. And you are exactly right. It's a morally loaded word. It has the immorality embedded in it, um, for it to potentially be murder. And yeah, it would be self defense or defense of your family if you're being invaded and have to, kill someone in defense. But in terms of that question about circumstance, I think that it reminds me of it's one of the first aphorisms that I wrote, and some of those are, just garbage, but uh, I write them anyway to find the good ideas out of all the bad ones. But there's an idea I call the idiot's whimsy, and I'd like to dispel something amongst the audience, or among the audience, I should say, that I think we both run into quite a lot. When we're in a creative space, there is a propensity toward this extreme subjectivism, right? Because it's hard to
Mhm.
hardline measure something, and we're talking about morally good in writing, or moral goodness in writing, or virtue in writing. I'm very sure there's going to be people saying, "Well, look, you guys are already admitting it depends on the person, the place, and the circumstance. Therefore, it's all subjective, right? Like that's just your opinion, man." Is the the phrasing, the way that we typically say that to mock it. But the aphorism I wrote, I call it the idiot's whimsy, because just because something is subject to factors that may be even individual, I would argue that it's not determined by the whim of that individual, right? Something might be particular to you in your time and place, but that doesn't mean you get to, you know, merely decide it, right? You could say that perhaps God's will applies specifically to each individual, but that individual is subject to the will and not the other way around. Does that sound about right as a way to point out that this isn't
Mhm.
just your opinion?
Yeah, and it's sort of there's what that is an attack on one of the fundamental pillars of language to say that sort of thing. And it sounds weird to say that, but it is, because right, the fundamental thing about what they're saying is, because there's a lot of factors and I can't necessarily predict all the factors going in, thus the only, thus essentially that means that I don't the factors don't matter. It's now a subjective decision, when that's not what is going on. And I think it's very dangerous when people say that. And I see this from time to time in the experiences of writers and creatives who have this opinion, is that they tend to apply it to themselves, and it's disastrous, because just like in a story, hopefully in your own creative journey, good actions bring about good results, and bad actions bring about bad results. And one of those ultimate bad actions you can take is a decision like good and evil is subjective in my own life, because essentially it's not a good thing to do, especially when it comes to creating things, because you've just removed a major constraint that is pushing you toward completing things rather than just doing them because you felt like it at that moment.
Yeah, there's no measuring stick, right? It becomes this.
Hmm.
It becomes, I think, by definition, an indulgence, is it not?
It is. It's an indulgence, and it's an easy cop out. It's an escape avenue when somebody sees that they have something that they should do. It's an escape avenue to say, oh, it's all subjective. That just comes from my subconscious, or that just comes from my preferences. It doesn't actually matter, because saying that lets you get out of doing the thing that you have that conviction that you should do. And you stop listening to convictions often enough, they don't come back, or at least they don't come back very loud. And, well, you'll suffer. Everything you do will suffer. It applies to
Yeah.
characters as well, of course.
Yeah. Before we I want to dive into characters and talking about morally writing morally good characters and examples and such. But before we do, there's a couple more notes in virtue. I think it would be undue if I skipped over this. So, I have the four classic Greek virtues, but then there's also three more Christian virtues that are added on top that I think are worthwhile talking about. So we have justice, prudence, temperance, and this one is fortitude. I think it's usually translated differently. I don't remember fortitude being listed amongst the four Greeks. What's the other? What's the usual word for it?
Courage may be the one they used. I
Courage.
haven't heard the
Yeah,
list in a while.
yeah. It's courage, not fortitude. So we'll say courage instead. So justice, prudence, temperance, courage, and then we have hope, faith, and charity. And something I noticed, as we're just talking about the fact that these people are indulging, is the way that they're indulging, as you mentioned, through an escape, and they're escaping something that would require a sacrifice, essentially, or some form of self denial. So when I'll go through all seven. So to be just, one must hold to one's principles even when it's not advantageous, because justice necessarily is not that which is advantageous. It's that which is in accord with what is right, right, which is the same as what is good, which is in accord with God's will, like as things ought to be. And so you have to hold to
Mm-hmm.
your convictions, hold to your principles, like you said, even when you don't want to. Prudence is not being reckless, right? It's holding yourself back when you otherwise would rush forward. Temperance is controlling your consumption of a thing, right? Not going to excess. Courage is not giving in to your fear. It's putting yourself in the face of danger. Um, Now, you might need to talk to me more about maybe hope, but because I would have a hard time distinguishing it from faith, really. But faith to me is this attitude ahead of time to already decide to put your will in accords with God's will and say that which God brings into being is good, right? That's how I define faith. It's an orientation of yourself toward affirming, if we're speaking in a Christian sense, God. And then charity, obviously, is the giving to others where you are, denying hoarding to oneself. Um, and again, if you want to talk more on hope, if you're familiar with it, you can. But what do you think of my? Is that significant? That identification that there's something about self denial or yeah, self denial is the phrasing that comes to mind now. That's intrinsically tied up with the virtues.
Yeah, because I would say that I'll speak to that first. Self-denial is another way of saying that your will is controlling your emotions, that the elephant rider is controlling the elephant in the psychological sense, that you are able to your mind and your spirit are in some sense able to get a master over the flesh and the emotions that go along with that, and to thus have an impact on the world. Most of these virtues refer to um, refusing to let the elephant be the director. And essentially, once you are clear and able to, once you have a conviction about something, you should be able to overcome all of your negative compunctions and make progress toward it. And that may be something that is dangerous. That may be something that is incredibly unpleasant, but that's how that is. And all of them work through the concept of the conscience. Now, you can argue that conscience is some psychological trick. It's very much not. Humans have a conscience. Now, most people in the world today learn not to listen to it. They're told that what they feel is bad, they shouldn't do, and what they feel is good, they should do. But that's not really what it is, and it's not really a rational thing either. Uh, your conscience tell you a conviction without it being something that you've rationally figured out yet. So it's definitely something that's a third thing that is not rational and it is not emotional. So it's something very distinct. And listening to that is something uh, that is a major part of what distinguishes somebody who is doing good from somebody who's doing evil. Although I won't call people good or evil. Everybody's both. Let's just get that out of the way. I would also speak on hope there briefly because you mentioned that I should. Um, Hope is less. Faith is the understanding that essentially faith is surrendering control to somebody else, or in God, to a greater thing, and accepting that your understanding of things is not complete. Whereas hope is more or less the understanding. Basically, hope is simplified heavily, is the expectation that as long as each of your steps is a good and virtuous step, that the outcome will be good and virtuous, even if you don't live to see it.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Then that's my brain did wrap those two into one, but I could see the utility in separating them because they are one is more of a um, consequence or function of the other. Faith being the more fundamental
Yes.
of the two. I do want to speak to the
There's
conscience. Oh, go
sorry,
ahead.
let me
Go
go ahead.
ahead.
Faith is definitely fundamental. Obviously, some of those come from Greek thought as well, but in terms of the Christian sense, faith is the fundamental underpinning virtue. Obviously, there's you could find all the Bible passages you want. Basically, summary: without faith, I am nothing. You you have the faith that you are submitting to a higher power, to a higher goal, and as long as you pursue that without doing anything individually bad, everything else flows from that. So all of the others come from that one, and that's a Christian idea.
Yeah, well, thank you for fleshing that out. And I actually do, I don't disagree at all that faith is extremely important. I actually think that without faith, one turns to life denial is the way that the Germans, for all their terribleness, the way that they phrase it, right, or a negation of life itself. Um, this is the same. If you guys ever read Paradise Lost, Satan basically makes this his thesis. It's in Faust as well. This idea that okay, well, I'm against God, therefore I'm against all things that God brings into being. Fundamentally, my purpose as Satan is to negate all being, all life, all everything itself. And that comes with a rejection of the world being the fundamental and the arrogance and then the resultant pride from that arrogance that like my will is the correct will and God's will is the incorrect will, right? That reality is wrong and I am right.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's absolutely correct. Where you have the seven virtues, you also have the seven deadly sins. This is very much a Catholic idea, but I still like it, even though I'm not Catholic. The all of the seven deadly sins spring out of a lack of faith and a essentially a focusing on the self over the higher thing. All of them come out of that, every single one. So all seven of the virtues come out of faith. All seven of the seven deadly sins come out of the lack thereof.
yeah, and I think we could tie that into the idea of conscience because I did want to wrap back around to that. Now, my idea of conscience is very much influenced by Jung, who was a psychoanalyst, but I would argue he came from a much more spiritual perspective. He gets accused of being occult, which isn't exactly, it's not exactly wrong, but it's wrong enough that we need to dig into it. But the idea, so we're going to probably not probably we're certainly going to depart on some of the nuances here, but I think the fundamental line will be exactly the same. So he mentioned people think of their conscience as this, tertiary. Um, what would we say? Epiphenomenon, I think is the proper term for that, like something second. But Yoon brought up, it's like, no, no, no. Your conscience is basically like your soul. Like that's more fundamental than your ego. The thing that we commonly refer to as I is not you. That's like this tiny little piece of you, a fragment of you that pays attention, but it hardly understands anything. And deep down, your conscience is where, let's say, your conscience is where the spark of divinity is, and it's your job as the elephant rider to actually pay attention and see that spark and to bring that spark up and out and manifest it in yourself, uh, which would put you in accord with God, because with the union psychological perspective, you are integrating, making yourself integrous, right? And what would you say? A person with integrity, by, let's say, identifying that line between good and evil in yourself, acknowledging the evil parts, and so that you can essentially reincorporate them so that they're in accord with the good rather than with what is evil, what is destroying you, what's turning you against life or turning you against God, right? So it's he would describe it less as being like the elephant rider mastering the elephant, and more as, let's say, because that description is like that the elephant rider could yank on a rein and make the elephant turn, whereas the union perspective is like you can't actually force the elephant to turn, but you can over time train it to follow the, let's say, we could call the narrow path. It's a much more negotiable, or no, it's described much more like a negotiation, and perhaps we wouldn't even disagree that way, because I think perhaps you would argue that virtue is practiced and gained through practice
Yeah.
rather than it being a force of will.
Yeah. A an act of virtue is potentially an act of will, but it is something that is, it might be virtuous the first time, but it is more virtuous practiced over time, and it's also easier for that person to continue to take those actions along that line. The longer they go along that path, the easier it gets. So it's not just a matter of, I use the elephant rider metaphor loosely, because in reality, what a lot of the times happens in a person who is trying to do good is the elephant is crashing off into the jungle in the wrong direction, and at some point that rider basically has to get off and walk, and it sucks because your emotions are running off and saying, this sucks, I hate this, everything's terrible, I really just want to do the other thing. And every step in the direction you want to go is really hard. But in eventually, the elephant calms down and comes back, and maybe starts to appreciate what's happening, maybe not, but it doesn't matter. That analogy does break down at that point, where it's not really that, because you're dealing with yourself as a at least dual natured creature. You have your material self, from which comes your bodily needs, your emotions, things like that. You have your intellectual process, which kind of in most people separates itself out and to do its own thing and to think while they're doing something else and to try to rationalize things. And and then you will have the spiritual aspect, which is where the conscience comes from. And the elephant rider analogy is useful, but it is not complete. Um, it's got its problems. And when you deal with the fact that a human being really is that sort of set of various things, which are all kind of forced to live together in an incomplete harmony, uh, that's kind of where you get the struggle between somebody trying to do good, but ending up doing evil anyway, right? That's where you get all that.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea that, if you're not an integrated unit, you're full of like pagan spirits and you're pulled in a multitude of directions, and you're always lost because you're never able to go any particular way. You're always yanked off the path, if you will.
Yep.
Um, so, with all that moral philosophizing out of the way, let's actually talk about something more closely related to writing, as you were very kindly trying to do earlier. And I think we'll start with writing morally good characters. So, when in your experience, Michael, when you're writing morally good characters, like what steps do you even have to take steps to make them that way? Is that something that comes naturally to you? Do you often write morally good characters, or do you typically write characters that might be a little bit more gray? Is that grayness merely, the early 2000s nihilism infecting everything? Like, in your writing, what do you do? What do you do? How do you focus on that? I threw a bunch of questions at you. Answer at your according to how you want.
Yeah, I do tend to have characters who are at least trying to do something good. I make them all incomplete in how they do it. There are a few times where I have a character who is embittered and disgruntled and more or less is just kind of doing that thing where they're kind of spinning their wheels because they're just trying to they're embittered by their experiences and their journey is to learn to go back and actually start taking steps of being virtuous again. Most of my characters though, um, in most aspects of their life, you see them doing good, but the story revolves around exploiting some of their weaknesses um, to make them make compromises in some way. And oftentimes, I won't actually necessarily punish that. Those compromises may be temporary problems, but if the character can overcome them and come up with something good out of the initial problem, then they'll potentially end up better than where they started, if not back to at least back to where they started in terms of not having those problems. But I do tend to generally avoid the everything's morally gray, it's all doesn't matter, nothing makes sense, haha. That is a early 2000s, um, sort of like every time I see that in a book, like various emo bands start playing in my head because I knew people in high school who were like that, and it just reads. I can read it in their voice, and it's really sad and frustrating. Um, in my opinion, the one of the things that makes a story very compelling is that it has a very clear understanding of what is good and what is evil. Whether the characters are doing it is a different story, but the a compelling character is one who is forced to confront a part of their life where they are not doing as good as they could, and at some point they have to they confront it. They at first fail to live up to what they should be living up to, and then later on they have a turning, and they begin to do good in that aspect, even if it causes them to make sacrifices. In fact, sacrifices they would never have contemplated at the beginning of the story.
Yeah. So my brain went a couple places. Start with your process of writing characters. It sounds to me that you write generally good but flawed characters. Would that be the right way to say it?
Yes, I don't believe that any person, real or fictional, is a perfectly good character. There's no journey for a character who's perfectly good, even assuming that you could create one. And my experience with people trying to create perfectly good characters is that the reader hates their guts because, well, um, nobody likes somebody who's perfect. It calls them out, and also they don't go through any struggles. I think that's partly incomplete. I think somebody who was perfect would still go through some struggles, but I don't, that's not what we see when people try to write it.
Yeah, that reminds me of so I've thought a lot about certain what do we say, not paradoxes, that's not the right word. There are certain terms that end up being kind of oxymoronic, and I think what that identifies to me is that the concept itself is bankrupt, right? So when we say like perfectly good, um, I think it's actually wrong to say that perfectly good is well. I think there's a problem with the word perfect, to be frank. But there's an issue where when someone tries to do it, it never comes out right. But then if you look at the most, let's say, like the most divine hero figure. We'll stick with Christianity and say that's Christ, right? So, like, and I got this from Jordan. I'm not a Christian scholar, though I really should study more Christianity, and I will in the future. I promise, guys. But even Christ on the cross, he says, for a moment, like, was it its Father? Was it why has I'm trying to make
The
sure the
correct
names. Why
quote
have you
in
forsaken me?
English,
Go ahead.
yeah, my
Go
God,
ahead.
why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, thank you. But I really liked when Jordan pointed that out because he said, "Look, even the most divine um, person, right? The thing that the highest aim that you could aim toward, has a moment of wavering, right? Like there is no, which kind of suggests there is no 100% good. There is the person who you could say." I think this is going to be the name of Jordan's next book, is he who wrestles with God. There is like that person who is doing his best and struggling toward what is good, and that is the highest good, not the attainment, because the attainment assumes that one already knows, and therefore one's knowledge is complete, which just reminds me too much of Satan, essentially, right? Because like to assume like my knowledge is complete is to assume that I know, therefore my will trumps whatever contradicts it, and that would mean if the will or the reality outside of me, if God contradicts my will, that must be wrong. Versus the highest being a struggle toward that which is good, acknowledges the gap between the subject and the object, and so that's, that is perhaps why flawed, like even the most morally good characters still must be flawed, or else they are rejected by the human spirit.
And one thing I will point out is that in the case of Christ, a character who had struggles but no obvious flaws, the whole point of the story is that people rejected him. That's the point. Is people were called out by the fact that he was too perfect. The same people who were saying we want him to be king, literally 7 days later, basically hauled him out and nailed him to a tree. Right? People don't like perfect. Perfect calls people out. So when you're dealing with fiction, uh, you will find that people will treat your quote unquote perfect characters as villains. Not necessarily because that's what you intend, but because that's psychology working against you as the writer.
Yeah, that comes up in the Brothers Karamazov, which I have read actually, that one, where it's that really famous case, with the jailer and Christ again. He shows up again, and essentially they lock him up because it's like, you're too perfect, man. We can't compare to you. You're ruining our whole plan. But yeah, absolutely, people react that way. So why don't we go through a couple examples of actually workable, morally good characters, from you can label ones in your own fiction or just established works of fiction you think that the listeners are going to recognize. Are there any characters that really for you stand out as like really successful, good, characters?
There's a few. Obviously, I like a lot of the characters you see in the biblical record for this. Some of the ones that are obviously explained as good characters include David as a good one. He makes absurd amounts of mistakes. He's not like he's referred to as a character who is good, and you see that in the if you read the stories, he actually seems to be good, but he makes a ton of mistakes. His family life is a tire fire because he just doesn't have the courage to manage his family life in a morally upstanding way because that would be difficult. Um, there's other characters in there as well. I won't name them. I'll name a couple and not give too much detail. One of them being Job. That's an underserved one as far as people who aren't Christians don't read that one very much. Um, Another one that's potentially a little interesting is to use Daniel, the character of Daniel. So go ahead and try those out from that source. From fiction sources in the general market, one of the ones that everybody really likes, and this is both the movie portrayal and the book portrayal, is Sam Gamgee in the Lord of the Rings books. Um, he is basically good. His flaws come from the fact that um, his flaws are primarily not flaws of his character; they're flaws of his knowledge and his limitations, where he often does something that is beyond his limitations, and he probably should have known not to do that. But you appreciate him for that because he, he's just he's just such a how do I say this? He's somebody who just seems like too pure for the world he's in, but in a way that doesn't make you feel called out. He's humble and he's laid back, but he just sort of is infinitely loyal and infinitely friendly to almost everybody except for one particular character. And the one time he's not friendly, it's a disaster, right? The one time he just lets his prejudices get the better of him, it nearly wrecks everything and dooms the world.
I have not actually read Lord of the Rings, so tell me what that action is. Spoil it for
Uh,
us.
so yeah, if you haven't read The Lord of the Rings, if you haven't seen the movies, it's the same in both of them. Him and his boss, his he calls him his master, basically the person who he was the gardener for back home, and he is now adventuring with, who is Frodo Baggins, who is carrying the One Ring. Essentially, the objectification of sin and evil is being carried by his boss, and they run across this creature called Gollum, who has been to where they need to go to destroy this ring, and Frodo, his boss, takes pity on Gollum because he sees this as potentially what's going to happen to him if he holds this thing for too long. Because that's what Gollum is, a creature created by the ring. He was a pretty meek little creature who got a hold of this thing, and it absolutely just twisted him into something horrific and something that is just miserable. And Frodo is infinitely sympathetic to this Gollum creature, but Sam doesn't trust him. Sam Gamgee hates this creature because for the same reason that this creature is constantly reminding him of what's going to happen to his friend and master if they hold on to this ring too long. And Sam never trusts it. And there's a big turning moment in the character of Gollum where he's Frodo is being friendly enough to him, try to get him to have his old self from potentially 1,000 years ago, when he was a normal person, reassert himself as a person, as a somebody who could have a normalish life. And there's a big turning moment where it's partly the cruelty of just meanness that Sam does to this character that causes him to revert back and to begin plotting against them and very nearly to succeed.
Oh, that's tragic. I didn't. I really need to read Tolkien.
Yeah,
I unfortunately came late into fantasy, and so I experienced a bunch of other things. And then by the time the films for Lord of the Rings were airing, uh, obviously this is backwards, but to me it seemed generic because everything had copied Tolkien, and
yep.
so yeah, so it's unfortunate. I haven't even seen the films, so maybe I'll see the
What I
films
will
and
say,
I'll go ahead, go
in
ahead.
the films, the Andy Serkis's portrayal of Gollum is really, really, really good. Um, and Andy Serkis actually does the modern audiobook for the Lord of the Rings. The actual voice actor for that character is the guy who does the entire audiobook. And when he does Gollum's lines, he does them in his Gollum voice from the movies. And it's just, sorry, this is a major sidetrack, but they're really, really good audiobooks. They use the soundtrack a little heavy, but it's really good, partly because it's the actor for that character who's doing it, and his little bit development role through it and his tragic story is such an important part to how the conclusion happens. And all the actors in those movies were they basically almost like became method actors for the purpose of of creating those movies in a lot of ways. Um, but Andy Serkis is a weird one, and um, he definitely came to identify with that character a lot more than I think he has his other roles.
Maybe I'll have to jump into the audiobook. I typically like reading the actual text, get more out of it, but that definitely sounds excellent. I wanted to comment on what might make Sam. It's Sam Well. Am I pronouncing that name right?
Samwise Gamgee. He's just referred to
Sam
as Sam in
Wise.
most cases.
Sam. All right, Sam Gage. But Sam, his character seems to work to me because he is good yet lacking certain virtues. That's what occurred to me when you were describing him, and the reason why I'm pointing that out is because maybe that's a useful thing to consider when you're writing the flaws into your characters. Is that it's not a question of his moral goodness; it's the fact that he doesn't possess certain aspects of, let's say in this particular case, masculine virtue, and that makes him relatable and likable, right? Because he's a good person. He doesn't have certain strengths of characters to facilitate that goodness all of the time. Uh, and that resulted
In
in a tragic outcome.
in some ways that's true. In other ways, it's actually that specific instance where he lets his emotions get the better of him. What you see throughout the books to that point is him being friends with everything. He's he gets emotionally attached to their pack animals on at least two occasions. This guy is he's the most friendly, the most reverent person when it comes to all these weird and wacky creatures that they run into. Um, he doesn't really shout at anybody. He doesn't really get mad. He gets afraid, but he he doesn't let fear make him run away. When he's afraid, he tends to step in front of people he thinks he should be protecting and put himself in the way. It's this one character of Gollum who he it might help to understand that he's somebody who heard about this character as a boogeyman from stories that his old boss told him when he was basically a teenager. Um, the character of Gollum is somebody who Frodo's uncle and Sam's former boss encountered in a dark cave almost 100 years ago, and he heard these stories from this old, retired adventurer, basically, about this creature that promised to, if that basically that encountered him in a cave and promised to eat him if he didn't think quickly, more or less. So this is a character he was predisposed to be prejudiced against, and when they encounter, he can't let his pity over he can't get his pity to the point where it overrides all that existing prejudice.
Right. So, one, I was trying to think where I want to go from here because we've covered a little bit on writing morally good characters. I guess, and we've got some really great examples. Do you have any particular specific advice that you would give, if you say you've got people listening and they want to write? Because there are a lot of people writing right now. I think I didn't actually pay any attention to the like indie publishing scene at all and the group of modern writers. So people were throwing around the name Iron Age of writing, which I think a lot of them want to harken back to like more morally black and white stories focusing on like moral virtue and goodness and hero stories, things like that. I still don't know anything really about that. I haven't dug into it in the least. However, I think there seems to me from a very tertiary is the wrong word, distant view, that is of interest. So, do you have any advice for people who might want to be able to write these good characters, to succeed at writing them, and not to come across as either, I would use the word propagandistic. There we go. I had to slow down to say it, or otherwise contrived, contrite. Obviously, you mentioned not making them perfectly, like super perfect, 100% good. They still have to have flaws. Is there anything else that you might say to that?
I will say that in my experience, a lot of what's in the modern quote unquote Iron Age, the characters are not very good. And I say that not in terms of they're not competent, it's that they are not good. They have virtues, but their virtues are not being applied. And they actually often come off as having villain arcs more than they do having hero arcs. Because essentially these writers have been basically reading this 90s and early 2000s fiction for so long it's infected their brains, where everything's morally gray and the person who wins is just as much a villain as the person who loses and all that stuff. It's terrible. And you can call somebody a virtuous person all you like. You have to demonstrate it in their granular nitty gritty actions. We have a character who's supposedly be a hero who you know ignores the well-being of his subordinates in some way. If he's cold and standoffish when people need him to be understanding, compassionate, or potentially charitable, that's not a good character. That might be somebody who is doing something that is going to benefit the world, but that is not the same thing. A character who is good is somebody who is moved essentially by all sorts of concerns. As you said, all these seven virtues, or moral foundations theory. Somebody who is has access to all of the moral foundations, and who doesn't let any of them go, get tossed into the bin to maximize one of the other ones. When you have a character who just cares about justice, that's a villainous character. When you have somebody who just cares about making sure everybody's taken care of, that's actually a villainous character. Somebody who is letting all the other moral aspects fall by the wayside to accomplish one moral task is a villain. And I think this is where I think a lot of the Iron Age is falling down. Is there are people who they want to make everything simple, so they distill it down to one moral axis, and that's not how that works. You kind of have to show somebody who is a little bit more dynamic and has a little bit more depth to them in terms of what they care about. You have to show them caring about multiple things. Oftentimes, having to stop pursuing their goal to care about something else right? Because essentially what that's saying, when they do that, what they are saying is my goal is important, but doing this thing right now that my conscience told me to do, that's more important, even if it's going to mean I lose the thing I've been chasing for a long time. And that is one of the thing I think a lot of these creators are failing to do, is to set that up. And there's a few people who are okay at that, and a few people who are hit and miss. I find, for example, some of John De La Rosa's work is very hit and miss on this. He does it well in some instances and badly in others, but at least he seems to be doing it more often lately, which is good. Um, Whereas some other authors seem to not have it at all. A character either doesn't have a goal to give up to start, to go chase somebody else's problems, which doesn't really show any virtue at all, or they don't stop and help other people. They continue to pursue their goals single-mindedly, and that's a problem. Um, Another thing I would say is that good is not the same thing as peaceful. Is not the same thing as is not the same thing as kind. There are times when good does not mean that you are nice to people. In fact, there's a lot of times. You can point to the famous example in the Gospels of Christ going into the temple and literally whipping people out of the building and throwing their belongings out after them. That's not an exaggeration. That's exactly what happened. He this is not a nice thing to do, and in fact, there were people who were trying to get him who were trying to get him hurt after that. And eventually that was part of the charges that were against him when he was killed. A famous quote from an author I like, C.S. Lewis, referring to his ultimate good character Aslan in his books. It referring, this is a character who's a lion, and somebody says, "Well, he's a lion. Is he safe?" And the other characters look at this one crazy, say, "Safe? Of course he's not safe. He's a lion, but he is good." And it's a good example of what's going on there, and it obviously that's the Aslan figure is a Christ figure in those stories, but in general that's true of good characters. Good characters are not going to do what you ask necessarily. They're not going to, if you come to them with a problem, they are not necessarily going to fix it the way you wanted to in the least harmful way to your other problems, because oftentimes that's what people will do, is they'll want somebody to help them solve their exact problem and not touch all the other problems they've gotten comfortable with. A good character or a good action would be to potentially go a little further than that and actually help them in ways that they didn't want to be helped, if possible. For example, um, Aslan isn't just there to rescue the character who's been kidnapped. He does a lot more than that. Um, he gets some of the other characters involved in an actual full-on pitched battle. He does kind of essentially set a moral standard on all the characters that they are expected to follow, and they all just understand that there are consequences for disappointment. So when you make a character who is good, don't make them safe. Don't make them somebody who is just like, a kitten pawing at things. That's not good either. And I think Iron Age is not very good at establishing this right now. I think it will get better though.
I hope that it does. Makes me feel a little bit good. For those of you out there, if you want, maybe perhaps I did a decent job, let me know. Go listen to the audiobook for One Spoke Broken and tell me if Conti fits our definition of good. There are a couple examples that I thought fit. So to entice the audience to go read my work, I'll go through just a couple of them. You mentioned having to give up something like you really wanted, and in order to pursue something higher. There's a particular scene, without spoiling too much, where the it's hinted at in the very first, let's say, I think page of the first chapter, and which is this big expedition. And a year goes by that finally this big expedition is coming about, and they're right at the threshold of the place they want to explore, and they're woefully unprepared, and disaster strikes, and essentially Conti has to just give up the whole thing, turn around, because his adopted daughter is essentially suffering poisoning, and he needs, like, okay, I just got to get her out of here. Nothing else matters, like literally nothing else matters. And sacrifice the chances for not just the chances for like wealth and success and fame, but he actually knows that failing this is going to put him in massive debt that's going to cause him to lose a lot of the things that he has gained over the course of the book. Right, so he essentially has a magic sword that's gone, along with a few other things, and um, yeah, it's going to put him under essentially. There are a few other moments too, though. You mentioned like it doesn't necessarily mean being a pacifist, where there's essentially a radical revolutionary guy leading a fairy mob in the town who will not give up right down to the last second. And Conti is basically trying really hard to get this guy to give up, and he won't. And he has to put him down because the man gives him no other options. But if he doesn't do it, then well, people have died, and the chances of more people dying um, because of this dude revving up a bunch of murders, well, that's a problem. So you could have. Uh, Hopefully, that's a good example of a morally good character. That was kind of the whole point of his character arc, is to go from someone who was evil, right, life denying, plotting revenge, to becoming a good person from that through some type of self overcoming that kind of fits in with the self denial we talked about earlier. I hope if you listen to the audiobook, oh, listeners, you can let me know in the comments. Now, we can move on while we still have some time to talk about themes, because I think the other side of writing good, right, good writing about goodness and justice and virtue and all that, is putting forward a theme in a work that is meant to, let's say, make good proliferate in a culture. I think would be the, I don't know, sociological way to describe it. What is your experience with reading books that have themes that you might say are good, and or writing books or stories with themes that are good?
I will say when I write, I don't actually set those things going in. I basically let those things get developed over the course of the first and often the second draft, and then I strengthen them in later drafts. So I don't go in with some message that I'm expecting to push regardless. Um, the definition of a story that is pushing a message regardless of whether or not it's actually has its workings and is established and essentially proved by the story, that's a story we call propaganda, and I try very hard not to do that. um, a person who does push a message or a theme too hard does have that problem of it becoming sort of propagandistic. And I think one of the ways that that you got to kind of look at this is that the theme is something that the characters should seem, at least to the reader, whether you came up with it beforehand or not, the theme is something that the characters are essentially proving out. It's not something that we're establishing as a baseline and just you know just reminding the reader of constantly. It's something that oftentimes you want to start with its contradiction and basically exhaust all avenues to lead to the contradiction throughout the actions demonstrated in the book. And you can do that with other characters than the main character. You can do that with the main character trying all the wrong ways before they try the right one, however you want to do that. Thematics are tough that way in that um, the human brain is very resistant to being told how it should think. So if you apply that too hard, you will have readers going the opposite way, and in fact taking the opposite message that you want them to. So I would say take a very light touch on that stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I right on board with all of that 100%. I don't like, in fact, I refuse to have a theme before a story is finished, because I view the theme as like a thesis. Now, I often say like a thesis is like an articulated argument, but you could also call it an answer. So, therefore, what I would start with is a question, right? So I come to the story with a question. That question is the the contradiction you mentioned. There's a problem that needs to be resolved. The characters are faced with that problem. The question is, what is the proper way to resolve this contradiction, this conflict that the story is centered around, um, or is it centered on? I don't know the proper phrasing. I'll think about it later. Uh, but yeah, you come to understand the theme through, like you mentioned, exhausting the potential solutions. Those are the complications in the plot as we're pursuing what is the morally correct answer. Now, if we remember what we talked about, what goodness is, it's in accordance with let's say God's will. Well, if you're secular, what is God's will? It's that which is the most fundamentally real. What is in accord with reality itself? What is it that brings forth the affirmation of that reality as opposed to its negation? That's a very Nietzschean way of thinking about it. But it turns out it doesn't contradict the Christian way of looking at it, I don't think, which is great because then we can all figure out what we're doing here. So yeah, your theme should not be something decided ahead of time. I really, I also work as an editor, and I will say when people ask me, because people want me to do developmental editing, even though my specialty is line editing, they really want me to do dev level editing. And when something I do see frequently is it's clear that the moral message was decided ahead of time, and that you said the characters they do actually come off as villainous quite often. Um, it's actually incredibly frequent how often that is. They lack a lot of virtues, and the world seems to bend to their will and not the other way around, which fits into that satanic model that we mentioned before. Uh, does that sound like we're having the same experience there?
Absolutely. I have seen this a lot of times. Um, what you'll see is that what happens is it's going back to that one moral axis thing I was talking about, where if your character is supposed to be good only on one axis, they're really just kind of a villain. Somebody with a theme going in really only defines the character's identity based on the one axis that fits that theme, maybe two. And then what happens is on the other ones, they don't, they put all their flaws in all the other axes and basically just set them up to be villainous. Um, a flaw potentially could cause somebody to fail on any of the moral axes. A flaw is not something that is somebody just, it could be that, somebody's flaw is that they just don't have any concept of justice, right? That could be a flaw, but that flaw is probably deeper than I don't have a concept of justice. It's something else. Um, so you see people writing these stories with a moral that they set going in, and oftentimes what happens is that character, their actions on everything but the moral axis relevant to that moral, are kind of awful, or the world just kind of makes them work because they're like, well, it doesn't matter, right? It does matter. The workings matter. Essentially, it's like, but the analogy I use a lot, and I probably used it on this podcast at least once before, is that what a story is when it comes to the morals or the themes is a proof, a mathematical proof. A mathematical proof is not the answer. You know the answer before you get there. It's the workings that show that from a set of understood axioms that are tautologically true, you can get to that answer that you were intending to get to. And you can either do that as I am starting out here and we'll see where we go, or you can start out knowing where you want to go and find your way down. As long as the workings are all there, both are okay. But people often skip the workings because they're trying to, I already decided what the moral is. Why do I need to show it? You absolutely do. That's how that works. And that's why I refer to stories that don't do that as propaganda. And I highly caution people against writing that way because it's unpleasant to read. It really is. And it's really, really unpleasant to try to edit and try to take that stuff out and somebody say, but that's the whole point of the story. Okay, delete it and start again. Sorry. I don't know what else to tell people. Like, it's difficult to help people with that. So I can't recommend against that sort of propagandistic moral, I guess, how do we say it? It's like, they have the moral. It's this big heavy hammer, and they're just going to hit every element in the story with the same moral, with the same little thing until the end, and it's really frustrating.
Yeah, well, as someone who has edited, and I actually, I'm kind of lucky. I've edited across the political spectrum. So I've got clients that are actually seemingly incredibly woke, and I've got clients that are kind of the reactionary right wing types. And so I've had to figure out what I'm going to say, right? I've had to do this, and it is difficult because you do get that response where it's like, but this is like the message. And what I've said to these people, I guess this is me throwing advice out there now, is that look, I understand you have this perspective and point of view, um, But if you want to give that point of view its best case, you have to do it in the most genuine way possible. That means you need to give your opposition or the opposing ideas as strong a shake as you could possibly do. You want to represent them well, and you want to, and that what that does is it gets them to consider those factors that they weren't considering, right? Because they were only operating under a particular moral axis, one axis or maybe two, or dimensions, if we want to use that word. It doesn't really matter. The point is they were only considering a couple moral foundations. But when you
Yeah.
force them, yeah, but when you force them to consider their opposition along other moral dimensions, all of a sudden it makes them have to confront those deficits, right? They if they're only thinking in terms of, I don't know, like let's use myself as a punching bag here, right? Because I happen to be very, 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 very politically libertarian. And so if you only focus on liberty and you don't focus on any of the other, let's use moral foundations theory, right? So if I can remember these offhand, there's loyalty, there's care, I think there's fairness, um, there's sanctity,
Sanctity and
there's
justice.
yeah. And so like there's other things you actually have to consider, like, and if you realize, okay, actually, yeah, sometimes like there's a limitation on liberty because if you don't, then injustice reigns supreme and like everyone suffers, so that's like harm, and all things that would be held sacred become profaned, right? Like, I don't know, the debauchery of children or some other terrible thing, which does happen.
Mhm.
So yeah, that'd be my advice to those of you indie authors out there, is if you are trying to write good characters, even if you think you or good themes rather. If you're trying to do something thematically deep and significant and impactful, give the opposite ideas their best shake. And by doing that, you'll give your own ideas a much better representation, and you'll actually kind of find out that you don't own your own ideas. Um, that's a union thing, but like ideas have people, not the other way around. And when you assume when you assume it the other way, what happens is you become a tool to the idea, and you produce propaganda, which propagates that idea like a virus, which you don't want to do. You don't want to just be the host for some pathological, shallow idea, right?
Of course not. Now, mind you, a lot of people are, uh, and it's difficult to when somebody is really deep into that. Their a concept of their idea is shallow, but it's a tight loop. Um, it's complete, right? It has all internal to itself. It has all of its own explanations. It has all roads lead back to it. And the problem with that is that it doesn't really have any room for any reasonable understanding of people beyond that idea. Um, and this is kind of what applies, I would say, both to some on the reactionary right and some on the far left, where their idea essentially defines that there's only a certain amount of allowable ways that somebody can oppose it, and those are only the weakest ways. Um, so even when they try to include people of other ideas in their work, they just can't do it because to allow the possibility that those people um, are not basically cartoonish mustache twirling cigar chomping, the penguin from DC style villains, their entire ideascape comes apart, and they're just not willing to make that change. um, I've run into that quite a few times, and it's very difficult. I don't know how else to help them fix it other than to just say you need to actually have these people who are antagonists seem like they have, especially if they're touting an idea, you seem like they're human. It's okay to have over the top villains as long as they're not the proponents of opposition ideas. Over the top villains are there, potentially, they're not actually the ones pushing another idea. Often it's the idea that is at the core of a story with an over-the-top villain is actually being wrestled inside of maybe the ensemble cast of the heroes, or inside the hero in their internal struggle between two different two different sets of ideas, and they need to come down to the one that's right to defeat that over the top, powerful but not but often cartoonish villain. So the characters don't all have to be like good proponents of those ideas, but when those ideas come up, they need to be at their strongest.
Yeah. I could talk again about Satan in Paradise Lost, but I think I'll refrain. We've run for a while, Michael. We covered everything I have in my notes. Is there anything in particular that you would like to discuss before concluding today? Anything you want our listeners to know about either writing good characters, good themes, or any other aspects of goodness that fit into writing that we just haven't touched yet?
I know we've mentioned it, but it's a good thing to end with. One of my favorite lines in all of literature is Solzhenitsyn's the battle line between good and evil is drawn through every human heart. That applies to characters as well. That the to some extent, especially with your heroes, there should be some amount of struggle to get, for them to seem like they're good. Good actions shouldn't be easy. They should involve some sort of internal struggle. If there's not much external struggle associated with them, internal struggle is necessary. But otherwise, it's just, you could have it either way. Um, Good should be difficult. That's what makes it kind of what makes it good, is that it's the right thing to do, but it's not the easy thing, because just like in Star Wars, the dark side's the evil path in Star Wars. In and that's fundamental. That's good and evil. Evil is often the shortcut path, or at least it seems like it at the time. So a character who never takes the shortcut, the easy way out, will often be seen as good, even if what they have actually accomplished is limited to nothing. Whereas a character who always takes the easy path, who never seems to struggle, will often seem as an evil character, even if they accomplish a lot of objective good things in their world.
That's very excellent. I'll tag on at the end there. You know, you could view life as being a tragedy, right? This is a very perhaps hermetic view of it, but I think if viewed the right way fits in. And our job is to transform ourselves into beings that look upon the tragedy of life as being good, which means to struggle to again, because if it's tragic by nature, right, there's things that hurt about life. It's not just easy sunshines and roses and indulgences. So our characters, therefore, must struggle to embrace those things that are difficult, and to view even the embracing of those difficult things as, let's say, an act of virtue in and of itself.
In the Christian sense, I could rephrase that to say that the world itself is a place which is steeped in sin, and it is fallen, it is dark. So a character who's too comfortable in the world, who achieves things too easily, is probably not on a virtuous or good path. A character who is on a good path in a world which we take as a precondition to be flawed and fallen will encounter problems. There will be obstacles, there will be roadblocks. And what makes them good isn't that they start to do something good, it's that when they encounter the roadblocks, they do the hard work to overcome them and continue, even when it's really hard.
All right, guys, you heard it here. Uh, we're in agreement from two different sides of the aisle about what writing good characters is like, and good let's say themes that promote goodness is like. So thank you so much, Michael. I actually really did and I always enjoy our conversations, and I know that our viewers do as well. So before we depart here today, can you direct people again where they can find your work?
Yeah, you can find me on minds.com/AETERNIS. We have daily writing questions. I do have some short fiction up there, 25-ish short stories that you can just read for free. A few episodes where I recorded an audiobook myself. I think there's a couple you can listen to for free, and then some you can pay for. And hopefully some more stuff you can buy from me fiction-wise soon.
I'm excited for that. So yeah, check out Michael's stuff. Subscribe to him over on Minds. I am a personal subscriber of Michael, and I think you should be too. I'm really excited to support your work. And I've beta read for you before, for those of you who don't know, and I can vouch for the excellence. And if you want to know whether I am excellent as well, check out wildoutlet.com. I'm not going to pitch the whole thing again, but yeah, do check out my audiobook for Want Smoke Broken, or you can buy it over on Amazon. The links are all there on my website. And tell me what you think. And thank you guys so much for listening in. And if you're a writer out there, I hope you start writing good. All right, guys, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.